name is Jeffrey Schindler, and this is my virtual presentation of my biomechanical model relating climbing to injury of the A2 and A4 pulley. First off, how dangerous is rock climbing? Well, rock climbing is actually one of the fastest growing sports, and it has almost 6 million participants in the United States alone. And even though films like Free Solo portray it as this edgy adrenaline junkie, climbing with no safety gear, if you fall, that's it type of sport, that really couldn't be farther from the truth. Most climbers, when they climb, have multiple safety systems in place, and those safety systems have multiple redundancies. And because of this, the most common injuries suffered when climbing are actually tearing the tendons and the pulleys within the hand rather than any type of injuries associated with falling. So what are the pulleys in the hand and what do they do? So the pulleys guide the tendons from the muscles of the forearm along the path of the finger so that when tension is increased due to contraction of the muscle, the finger will curl because the tendons are held to the finger. A great example of this is, say you catch a big fish and you're reeling it in and you're increasing the tension on the fishing line. What happens, right? The fishing pole bends. The reason for this is because as that tension increases and it's pulled against the eyelets, which are acting in the same way as the pulleys of the finger, you get this resultant force actually acting this way, and that bends the fishing pole or finger. Now, depending on how much bend there is and how much tension you're talking, this force can be multiplied several times. And that's why it's important in climbing, because on small holds and you're supporting all of your body weight on those holds, you can really start stressing these structures in the fingers in a way that's not really seen in hardly any other activities. So when climbing, there's a few different grip styles. The main two is the sloper / open hand, where the proximal interphalangeal joint here is almost fully extended. And when the proximal interphalangeal joint is in that full extension, you can see that the tendon is running in line with the finger and the pulleys, and there's really hardly any force being pulled down on those pulleys, trying to tear them away from the finger. However, the downside to this is because you're sloping off of the hold, hence the name slope grip, the odds of you sliding off that hold are a lot higher. So to climb more effectively, more advanced climbers will start using what's called the crimp grip, where you use extreme flexion of the proximal interphalangeal joint to get the hand up and over the hold so that you can increase the friction and kind of the mechanical advantage on that hold. So as you go from half to full to closed, you're just making a more and more extreme kind of flexion of that proximal interphalangeal joint. You'll actually start hyperextending the distal interphalangeal joint, and in the most extreme case with the closed, you bring the thumb up over and what they call lock off. This allows you to apply even more force to the fingertips on a small edge. Now this combination of proximal interphalangeal joint flexion and distal interphalangeal joint hyperextension creates such a strong tendency for bowstringing that the friction is increased greatly, and then you get these really strong resultant forces acting this way, trying to pull the tendons away from the finger. And if that becomes too strong, then you can actually overcome the strength of that connective tissue and begin to tear those pulleys. So pulley injuries are ranked from grade 1 to 4, grade 1 being the least severe. That would be just a sprain, so nothing's going to show up on any imaging. Just rest a few days, you're probably going to be good. As you progress 1, 2, 3, you'll start to see partial tears. So again, as that bowstringing becomes too strong, here we see a partial tear of the A2 pulley. And as you get up to grade 4, that's when we'd expect to see a complete rupture of the A4 and A2 pulleys when climbing. Once you have completely ruptured multiple pulleys within the finger, resting and therapy will not be enough to heal that and regain function of the finger, and then surgical intervention, grafting of new connective tissue will be necessary. And the reason that this is necessary is because we see here in this lower picture, as you apply force down on the finger, when you try and contract the muscles and curl that finger against any force, that this just gets wasted into bowstringing the tendon up and away from the hand rather than curling the finger. Studies on cadavers in the past have found that about 120 to 400 newtons of force pulling away from that pulley is sufficient to tear pulleys in just normal individuals. It is important to note that repeated stress of these connective tissues will build them up, and that's why professional rock climbers, after years of climbing, can withstand 800 to 1,000 newtons of force at the pulleys without suffering any injury. So why model pulley forces? A lot of people have never even heard of the pulleys in the fingers, and that's actually the reason why I chose to model it. When lifting something heavy, we all have heard, I'm pretty sure, lift with your knees, not your back, because we understand the biomechanical forces involved with lifting something and why you don't want to lift with that lower back, because it can injure your back. An injury like pulley ruptures that really is only happening in activities like climbing, people don't know about these and they don't understand them. So by kind of picking it apart, modeling it, and making some good visual representations, the idea is to help people better understand what to avoid so that they don't injure their pulleys. So as we have more people climbing, when they show up, hopefully they'll know what not to do instead of injuring and then finding out after the fact. How is the model made? Just a quick slide on Stella, which is kind of a digital playground for simulations. You build the model with several different pieces, and then this slide here is just showing a whole bunch of kind of gross math that I was able to derive out from different sources, mainly a study that was done on 8 to 10 climbers with both voluntary and involuntary contraction and force on the fingertips via a electromyogram. Again, there was only 8 to 10 people, so this isn't going to be an end-all be-all. It's just kind of a rough model to show what we expect to see in a broader sense rather than the exact forces every individual is going to have when climbing. So the first scenario that I modeled was mapping the same fingertip force. So if you can imagine the same hold, the same person hanging from it, with either a slope or a crimp style grip. So the blue line on the bottom is the slope style, and the red on the top is the crimp style. On the y-axis, we're seeing that resultant pulley force, that force trying to rip the pulley away from the finger. Now what was interesting was the A2 is the most commonly ruptured pulley in climbing, and through modeling it suggested that there's about 25.8 times the force at the same fingertip force applied to the pulley in the crimp grip compared to a slope style or open hand grip. The A4 pulley was only about 4.7 times the force acting through that A4 pulley when using the crimp style grip versus slope style grip. The main reason for this is because both the flexor digitorum profundus and flexor digitorum superficialis are running through the A2 pulley, so you have two tendons from two separate muscles versus only the flexor digitorum profundus tendon running through the A4 pulley. Something else that was really interesting that I learned from this model was it's kind of been suggested based on past studies that when using the crimp style grip, the chances of suffering a grade 4 where you rupture both pulleys is a lot higher using the crimp style grip than the slope style grip. When the slope style grip is modeled here, there's a huge discrepancy between how much fingertip force is required to start putting you in that danger zone of injuring a pulley. However, when the crimp style grip is used, the lines for how much the force goes up based on fingertip force between both the A4 and A2 are almost identical. Now why this is important is because this kind of explains why using the crimp style grip increases your likelihood of tearing both, because they were both hitting 400 newtons of force at the pulley at right around 175 newtons of fingertip force. The second scenario that I modeled was kind of exploring if you were to hang off of a edge in the slopestyle grip and then transition, so flex your fingers through their range of motion up into the crimp style grip, how would the force multiplier and the amount of force on that pulley change through the flexion. So on the x-axis here at 180 degrees all the way at the right, that would be a completely straight finger, so even past a slopestyle grip that would just be your fingers completely straight. And then on the left at 90 degrees, that's about full flexion on that proximal interphalangeal joint. On the left, it's kind of showing at about 97 newtons of input force on the fingertip, how much would be felt at the pulley between a straight finger and a bent finger. So for the A2 pulley, we started at basically 0, and it spikes all the way up to almost 600. For the A4 pulley, again, almost 0 with a completely straight finger, and spiking all the way up to 500. The more interesting thing about this is that when you're in the slopestyle grip, you're obviously not going to be completely straight finger, but you'll be right around here in the 170s. By the time you transition to a crimp style grip, you are multiplying the force of the pulley by over 70 times at the A2 pulley, by over 150 times at the A4 pulley. Again, this is just more evidence as to why climbing with that crimped grip, or worse off, the locked off crimp style grip, where you're not only multiplying the force of the pulleys, but you're increasing the total amount of fingertip force, can easily result in tearing of these connective tissues within the hand. So, kind of in summary, it becomes clear as you explore the biomechanics of the hand and climbing itself why these small edges and pulling and hanging off of them can lead to the tendons literally tearing away from the finger. And also becomes pretty evident that as you flex the finger, the closer you get to 90 degrees of flexion, you're just adding more and more and more force to those pulleys as they're fighting that bowstringing. So does this mean that when you're climbing you should just absolutely not use the crimp grip at all? No. It is necessary for a lot of routes, and it is useful. The idea of modeling this is just to help people understand just how much more force is applied to their fingers when using the crimp style grip, so that they can be more aware when they're using it. You certainly wouldn't want to go out as a brand new climber, do a full lock off crimp, and then do a pull up off that. There's a really good chance that would just tear your fingers. And also it acts to explain why kind of intermediate climbers, they're not brand new, they're starting to get stronger, they're starting to go on the harder routes. They start using these grip styles before that avascular connective tissue of the pulleys and tendons have been able to build up. It kind of explains why they're the ones that oftentimes suffer the grade 3s and grade 4 pulley injuries when climbing. And there's references.